Hey, not to scare you, but Giving Tuesday is right around the corner, and I want to help you get ready. Join me for a free webinar with my friends at GiveButter on November 6th, all about specific ways to drive donations on Giving Tuesday using social media. I'll focus on sharing very tactical ways and real-world examples, all designed to increase your results on this International Day of Generosity. You'll walk away with practical tips, ideas, inspiration, tools, and useful resources to make this Giving Tuesday your most successful yet. Just go to jcsocialmarketing.com/givebutter to register. That's jcsocialmarketing.com/givebutter. I hope to see you November 6th. Hello, and welcome to Nonprofit Nation. I'm your host, Julia Campbell, and I'm going to sit down with nonprofit industry experts, fundraisers, marketers, and everyone in between to get real and discuss what it takes to build that movement that you've been dreaming of. I created the Nonprofit Nation podcast to share practical wisdom and strategies to help you confidently find your voice, definitively grow your audience, and effectively build your movement. If you're a nonprofit newbie or an experienced professional who's looking to get more visibility, reach more people, and create even more impact, then you're in the right place. Let's get started. Hello, you are listening to Nonprofit Nation with your host, Julia Campbell. Thrilled to be with you wherever you are listening, folding laundry, walking your dog, driving your kids to a variety of activities, as I do every day, all day. In this episode, I am so excited to welcome back the brilliant and talented Tamsen Webster. Tamsen is a renowned message strategist, author, and keynote speaker whose latest book, Say What They Can't Unhear, The 9 Principles of Lasting Change, just launched on October 8th. And she brings her 25 years of experience in message design and change communication to the table, offering authenticity and vulnerability and offering actionable insights for anyone looking to create meaningful, lasting change. And that is so important right now in a world of clutter and noise and turbulent times and artificial intelligence. So I am just thrilled to have Tamsen back on the podcast. Welcome back.
I'm so excited to be here and to talk about how all of this came from my background in nonprofit and how I think so much of it was just trying to solve the issues I faced in all the years I spent in nonprofits and talk about how all this can hopefully help your listeners as well.
And the last time we talked, we focused on your first book, which is an absolute must read. I will put it in the show notes. Find Your Red Thread. And that book focused on helping people make their ideas irresistible. And now with your second book, Say What They Can't Unhear, which I love that title, Say What They Can't Unhear. You are diving into the principles of lasting change. So what's the inspiration behind the second book and how do these two books connect?
Well, it was funny. I just had this insight as you were saying that. The Find Your Red Thread is 100% about how to make an idea irresistible. Mm-hmm. And while implied in that was, and help them continue to find it irresistible after they initially do, this book really arose out of that specific challenge. That a lot of times in so many areas of our lives, someone will say yes in the moment. They'll say yes quickly, or they're like, well, yeah, follow up. And then they ghost you, or then they back out, or, if even to make it personal, there are times when we've acted quickly, found something irresistible, and then buyer's remorse or donor's remorse set in. We're like, wait, whoa, what was I thinking? And so I got really interested in that question, not only because it was implicit in the first book, but I got interested in why wasn't it more common in the first place for us to not just drive action, but lasting change. Because in any resource-constrained environment, which that's pretty much most nonprofits, certainly was in all the years that I spent there, You don't have the time, you don't have the resources, you don't have the money, you do not have the people to continue to make up for every yes that turns into a no later, right? You want a yes to stay a yes from the beginning and grow into yes and yes, let's do this next. So it was really about that. How do we just go from something that somebody finds irresistible, and how do we make it into something that is internally motivating for them afterwards so that they keep acting in a way that helps you and them?
That's fascinating. Also, yes, and did you take improv classes?
No, I just work with a lot of people who've taken improv.
I'm thinking of Amy Poehler's book called Yes, and all about improv classes. I just think that's just fantastic philosophy.
Yes.
But this is so interesting because what nonprofits often struggle with is that lasting connection and donor retention and keeping this excitement and inspiration and motivation throughout the years and really making this lasting change and building this lasting relationship with their donors and their supporters.
Yeah.
I love this. I cannot wait to read this. But you've structured your new book around 9 persuasion proverbs.
Yes.
So can you give us sort of like a taste, an overview,
sure.
and the framework?
I can give you all 9 if you want.
Yes, please.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. So the book opens with this idea, with the first one, which is that change isn't just an action, it's a reaction. Wow. Meaning, again, that's where I'm really talking about this difference between action, which is a one-time or short-term behavior change or thinking change, one short-term relationship, and long-term change, right? So when somebody's changing, of course it's an action, but particularly when you're in the position of helping someone make that decision or trying to create the conditions where they would, if you're a gift officer or a leader, right? Whatever it might be. So much about this new concept that you're introducing, this new opportunity, this new initiative, et cetera, because it's new and you are the source of information about it, a huge amount of whether or not that sustained action will happen has to do with how they react to what you say to them in the first place and how. So that's one of the interpretations of this idea that change isn't just an action, it's a reaction, is that a lot of times we're focusing so much on the change that we're not focused on how are we approaching asking for it in the first place.
Oh, wow. Yes.
And that's an issue because of the second piece, which is this, the reaction. You can think of it almost like a re-action. That is what true change is acting not once, but over and over and over again. And in order for that to happen, that approach has to build in that kind of desire, that kind of irresistibility, not just in the beginning, though it does, but also it has to be built on things that are going to last as long as you want that change to last.
Absolutely. So talk about the persuasion proverbs.
Yeah. So the persuasion proverbs, so that's just a quick example. There are 8 more. They are a collection of mantras and concepts that I had developed and synthesized in my own head over these 25 plus years that I focused on persuasive communications, change communications in some way, which has included supporting nonprofits as a director of marketing. I also did fundraising communications for Harvard Medical School. And so what I discovered, because I was deeply interested in transformational change, even on the personal level and working with nonprofits, so many of them are working on creating change at not just the individual level, but societal level, et cetera, or sometimes just kind of preserving in the sense of arts, et cetera, preserving kind of different perspectives on things. I found that through my research that there were things that I found worked, that were evidence-based, that were actively used successfully in other areas of practice, not change communications, not nonprofit communications, not business marketing, fundraising, sales, all of that. And yet they worked. And so what I wanted to do was take these lessons that I had learned and that come from these other areas and distill them into, hopefully, 9 persuasion proverbs that the reader can't unhear or the listener to the audiobook can't unhear. Just phrases, again, to keep these concepts sticking in the head, like change isn't just an action, it's a reaction, or one of the big ones that was behind my first book, that every decision has a story.
The first book was a lot about storytelling and the power of storytelling. I think that is it's so important. And I know a lot of nonprofits understand the power of storytelling. And that brings me to one of the core themes in your book is ethical persuasion, moving away from using authority, pain, or manipulation to drive change, which for so many fundraisers can be a difficult line to walk. Mm-hmm. So why do you believe these traditional tactics often fail?
So manipulation and coercion, let's just take those off the table right there. Is it almost always when someone kind of realizes later that it's happened, that will undo the change in the first place, because their rationalization will take over, and and not only will they reverse the change, but you've now damaged the relationship at the same time.
Yeah, you've cracked the trust.
You've cracked the trust because it was either a bait and switch or something wasn't actively rewarded, and this is oftentimes where pain, fear, struggle, emphasizing all of that can come in, where what happens at that point then is that when we focus so much on urgency and negative consequences and all of these things, and it's not that they're not real, it's not that they're not important, it's not that we need to skip over them. But what happens when it goes wrong is when we are introducing that kind of fear, we are purposely introducing it in order to drive action, rather than identifying it and creating it as context for what needs to happen next. And I know that's a very subtle distinction, but the reason why it's so critical is that any decision made out of fear, anxiety, urgency, someone hasn't had a chance to really think through, is being made out of an irrational part of the brain.
Oh, right.
Right. It's happening through, what Daniel Kahneman calls system one thinking. It's fast. Like, your brain is not capable in those moments of really being open to new ideas. It's just looking to relieve the pain, to stop something. But eventually that moment.
It's like rage donating a little bit.
Oh, rage donating. Absolutely. But eventually that moment passes. And then system two, the slower thinking, the more rational brain takes over, the prefrontal cortex takes over. And so that's when someone goes, well, wait a minute. Now, it doesn't mean that you, again, starting with some acknowledgement of pain or emphasizing urgency won't work, but it absolutely means that you have to have a case for this change, for this action that survives that rationalization step. And that's where this kind of idea of every decision has a story happens, because that story that people can tell themselves about that action or behavior or decision is what will determine whether or not that decision stays. Because if the story makes sense, then the decision will make sense and it will feel right to them. But if they can't reconstruct a story for why it made sense or why it continues to make sense, well, then they won't continue the action. So that's one of the primary reasons why, I encourage that shift. But also think about it in another context. If you've ever been to therapy or known anyone who has done that, therapist who is trying to achieve long-term change in thinking or behavior is not starting off with all the things you're doing wrong, all the consequences that are going to happen, all the awful things that are impending. Because, you already know that. It's why you're there. So again, when we think about it in a different context, of course, it doesn't make sense that we would start from a decision for, an attempt at long-term change in a point of taking the other person down or putting them into a position of fear. And yet, for whatever reason, and I do have my opinions on this, that's what we have been, even not directly taught, that there are people who teach that. It is what we have taken away from the teaching on that.
I know that, for me doing online marketing, I have had to unlearn a lot of the things that I had learned about manipulation and urgency, the false sense of urgency, really trying to delve more into ethical communication. And I also know that ethical storytelling, trauma-informed storytelling, ethical communication, that is really, I love to see it being talked more about at conferences and on podcasts and in books, because the sector for so long, I think we really looked at the Sarah McLachlan ASPCA ad, Arms of the Angels. That ad raised millions of dollars, but at the end of the day, I think people are fatigued. We have compassion fatigue. We don't want to be manipulated in that way. We want to give to causes. We don't want to sugarcoat what's going on. Like you said,
Right. Yeah.
These are important issues. We're not trying to tie a bow on everything and pretend that everything is rainbows.
No, not at all. But
but we are doing it in a way that,
Yeah, it's a pairing. I mean, it's, the other big thing that Kahneman is known for, beyond system 1, system 2, is prospect theory. This whole idea of that we are more wired to avoid loss in the short term than we are to pursue a long-term gain. So, of course, then the most powerful pairing would be something that acknowledges the current pain of a situation and is paired with, where are we trying to go? There's actually a whole field of facilitation and inquiry called appreciative inquiry, which I've come to know about recently, which is based on solid research in linguistics and cognitive behavior and cognitive psychology. What they are doing and what they talk about, what they mean by the appreciative piece, is rather than frame things in terms of the problem, frame things in terms of the question that we are trying to answer. And that it isn't just how do we solve the problem. It is, instead of, for instance, a lot of times appreciative inquiry is used in equity work, but instead of like, how do we retain more employees of color? An open-ended question there would be, how can we make this a comfortable place to work for everyone? How can we achieve equity in this organization? And what they found from the research is that when we frame something from a problem, we actually narrow the options that our brain will consider, because our brain goes to look is it fixed, not fixed, rather than what are all these options. Now, this is really important from a fundraising perspective, and you can see it because when we basically say, if you give to this thing will happen, like we'll solve this problem. Usually not true if the nonprofit serves in any way to address a complex issue. But we want them to continue to stay engaged. And a question that remains answered or that can evolve as certain pieces of it get answered is the kind of thing that actually supports this longer term framing of something. So it's a really key part to, framing something instead of how do we solve this problem of hunger, or how do we solve the problem of
climate change.
Climate change, exactly. Which, by the way, we can't with one thing. The question is, how can we ensure that we're leaving a legacy for our children? How can we ensure that those that come after us have an equal chance at survival and success as we did? So when we start to frame things as an open-ended question, you start to see that there's so many possible answers. And it's that kind of keeping the options open that is really important for that longer term engagement. It doesn't mean that it didn't start from a point of pain, right? We're seeing the effects of climate change. And instead of saying, well, how do we solve climate change? Because then again, it starts to get overwhelming pretty quick. We can say, okay, what is this? What is our organization? What question?
What's our role?
Right? Yeah, exactly. What question related to climate change? What question related to this thing are we here to answer? And what I have seen that do is it really starts to put something different at the center. I know in nonprofits, we've gone from mission at the center to donors at the center to the community at the center. And, and I'm an advocate for putting the narrative at the center, meaning what is that question that we are here to answer? What are our core principles that determine why we're approaching it this way? By the way, there's this extra benefit that comes from that is, of course, there's multiple organizations working to solve climate change. Of course, there's multiple organizations working to talk about, working to solve food insecurity. But each of them exists to answer a different aspect of that question. And even if they're answering the same question, they are answering it in different ways. And so your ability to articulate not only what question are you answering, but why you answer it in that way is the basis for creating that ongoing story, which is what a narrative is, that keeps people connected to you over time.
Wow, I love that. People are going to be rewinding that. I can just see myself in my car sometimes when I listen to a podcast and I need to rewind everything that I just heard. That was a lot of food for thought. And I think
probably too much at once. I
think it was wonderful. I know, your book really does highlight behavioral, cognitive, and psychological principles behind lasting change, which I think is fantastic. The title of the book, which I have said before is phenomenal, suggests that the key to successful communication is saying things, saying, writing, broadcasting, however, things, ideas,
right.
communicating, things that people can't unhear.
Yes.
So what goes into crafting messages that people can't unhear?
So what goes into crafting messages that people can't unhear? You know, it's so funny. I was actually just reading something this morning where I highlighted and I'm like, that's what's happening.
Well, something like you would highlight and put in the post-it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what's happening is that generally people are operating under a certain kind of theory of how to approach answering a question in a certain way, right? And what becomes something that somebody can't unhear is another theory, another case that is as strong and ideally even stronger than the one they've just heard about how to approach something. So that then leads to, okay, that's what we're trying to do, obviously, Tamsen, whatever. Yeah, but what makes something really strong is by anchoring it in things that people already want or already invested in one way or another. And that means anchoring whatever it is you do, anchoring that question as a question that your stakeholders are already asking and don't yet have an answer for, right? That's important, right? Because then you don't have to do the work of making them interested, right?
Yes.
If they're already interested in some aspect of what you can help deliver through your work or through the gift that they can give to you or through the services that you provide, then you don't have to do the work of education at that level, right? Like, is there a broader role for that? Absolutely. But resource constraint, right? Start with the lower hanging fruit on this, which is what questions are they asking right now for which your organization and whatever aspect you're asking them to engage with is going to provide a legitimate answer. And then as you're explaining your answer, anchor it in principles and concepts that they already understand and importantly, already agree with. So, I did a lot of work in an earlier part of my career with performing arts school, the Boston Conservatory here in Boston. And, that's an interesting challenge because it's a performing arts school and it was not inexpensive. It's now part of Berklee College of Music. And so we framed, I'm retroactively applying this to this. I basically, let me be clear.
I love it.
This is not how I was thinking about it at the time, but I can look at it and go, oh, that's what we did. So looking back on that, the question we were asking, particularly for the parents and guardians of these students, but also for the students, which was, how can I make sure that this
investment going to pay off?
Exactly. Like, how are we going to make sure that they're actually going to work? Like, how can we do that? How are we going to make sure that they're actually going to work? And so really, and if you think about it, if you back up, like that's what the conservatory, that is a way to frame the question they exist to answer. How do we produce working performing artists? And so we needed to do the work of stepping back and saying, well, what is our philosophy on that? What do we think is the best way to recreate that? And one of the key principles of the approach, again, retroactively putting it on there, is that it isn't just talent that determines whether or not somebody works. It's employability. So, and talent is part of that when you're talking about the performing arts. But if somebody actually isn't employable, right, then they are not going to be that. So we're saying, okay, so we're actually focused on employability. So is this going to be worth it? Employability, yeah, because if they're not employable, they're not going to work, right? There's going to be a point at which they may have all the talent in the world, but if people don't want to work with them,
Absolutely.
They better be really great. And even then, it's going to be hard. But that's not enough, right? Okay, but we still have to figure that out, right? And so it's like, okay, well, what's the key in our view to being employable? It was saying, well, actually not showing up as a diva, not showing up as a prima donna, not showing up without being equipped to deal with the most likely early experiences they were going to have, which is going to be things like, great, you're a concert oboist. Your first job is probably going to be playing in the pit of a musical theater performance, right? And if you're a dancer, you're not going straight to Alvin Ailey, right? You're going to be someplace else, which at the time gave us a beautiful basis for our fundraising as well, because our philosophy was, again, we didn't say it this way at the time, but it was to recreate reality. It was a way to explain why we had a multidisciplinary approach, why our concert musicians played in the pit for our musical theater performances and for our dance performances. It was also how we explained how we had really crappy practice rooms, because we're going to be like, well, what's more likely, that your student is going to be like practicing their oboe in a perfectly hermetically sealed practice room, or they're going to have to be doing it in their like unair conditioned apartment in New York? Well, guess what our practice rooms are like, right? So, and we had poles in the middle of our dance room. So we could basically say to them, we create working artists. We train working artists, right? Because we recreate reality to maximize their employability. Now, and then, of course, we need to deliver on that. But that's the kind of case that I'm talking about, right? Where we're saying, like, exactly. And it becomes something they can't unhear because we've anchored it in something that they are already curious about. How are you going to do this? I'm worried about this. How are you going to do this? How am I going to make this investment worth it? And we're anchoring it on principles that we believed to our core, right? Mm-hmm. That employability is as important as talent, right? And recreating reality is one of the most important paths to employability besides talent. Mm-hmm. So therefore, that's our philosophy. Mm-hmm. And when we could lead with that, and we did in our own way, then it becomes, again, for the right student, that becomes something you can't unhear. Now, could New England Conservatory make a case for hermetically sealed practice rooms? Of course. But this is where I come down to it, especially when we're thinking about nonprofits. Both of them are conservatories. It's just different approaches. That's it. And yet we're not able to articulate that very often. And so really what this book is about the principles that help you get to not only your own theory of change, but how do you make sure that theory of change, what has to be present in it in order for it to be as irresistible both in the short and long term as possible?
What I love about this is recognizing that your message is not for everyone. There are people that won't even listen to it. There are people that will hear it and will forget it, but you're speaking to the people that can't unhear it, because those are going to be your biggest supporters and your cheerleaders and your donors.
That's right.
And it's attracting those people. It's creating a message based on your philosophy and your values. You're not changing what you're doing or who you are, or your brand voice or your mission. You're just articulating it in a way that's going to really resonate with the correct group of people, or like the Precisely. Most excited group of people. And that's right. Not everyone. And that's what's so hard for nonprofits to understand is you're not for nobody, and nothing is for anyone. Not even Taylor Swift is for everybody. So
nope.
She's probably the closest thing, but I think we have to recognize that we have to put ourselves out there, because without putting ourselves out there with this message, we are not going to speak to the believers, right? Speak to
or even allow them to find us.
Or even allow them to find us.
I mean, part of what got me down this whole path prior to this, I mean, like I said, this is very much the product of 25 years of thinking about this and working through in real life scenarios, like what works, what doesn't, like what keeps working, what doesn't. And, one of the places that I started by being curious about was actually observing the behavior of donors. So I've been in Boston for 30 years now. I first started working in nonprofits when I volunteered for the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum while I was in college.
Isabella Stewart Gardner.
So awesome.
My daughter's name's Isabel, so they technically let us go for free.
Love that. And so, but what I noticed, because after the Gardner Museum, after grad school, I worked at another museum, the PBS Museum up in Salem. And then I went to the Boston Conservatory, and then I was at Harvard Medical School. And then I worked for a local brand strategy firm that worked with a lot of our local nonprofits as well. That was Sammons Blackstone. So we worked with WGBH. We worked with who else? The Symphony. And what I noticed, because, I was always related to messaging and or programming in all those organizations, was that at the highest level, and I'm sure this is true in almost any city, the donors were the same. I mean, famously in Boston, we had, and everybody knew who he was, the anonymous donor. And whenever it was referred to as the anonymous donor, you knew who that was. I will not reveal. It's like a little game for anybody listening who's from Boston. Everybody knows who the anonymous donor was. But I was fascinated that the anonymous donor donated at very high levels to the PBS Museum, to this autism group at Harvard Medical School, to other things at Harvard Medical School. And yet the gift officers were like, the anonymous donor likes to give to this kind of thing. And I'm like, how can you say that when I'm seeing the anonymous donor give to all of these different things? Or I look at a family like the Lynches, the Peter Lynch of Fidelity. And again, looking at, they, in addition to the museums and to the symphony, they also gave very heavily to the hospitals and to Catholic charities because their faith was very important to them. And so again, I'm just really curious. It's like, if we've got something, at that point, I don't think the Lynches were big donors at the medical school. I was like, well, what is it about the medical school that might appeal to them, right? Because it's like, how do we tie what we're doing into what we can observe they're interested in elsewhere? And that's really where this idea of what question are they trying to answer with their giving across organizations, where does that come in? And so it really started from that perspective, because if you can anchor on that, if you can start to suss that out, is not just why do they give, right? But what's the nature of their giving? Are they trying to kind of accelerate understanding? Are they trying to preserve tradition? Are they trying to expand opportunity? Are they trying to, solve a particular problem? Are they trying to, with the medical school, are they just trying to understand why there still are open questions in the first place when it comes to things? Then you can start to say, that's how it shows up in Catholic charities. That's how it shows up in medicine. That's how it can show up in museums. And then you can take it to your own organization and go, this is how that question shows up for us. So it's an opportunity to really expand not only who you're talking to, but expand what they give to as well.
I think tying into that, in the book, you say that leaps of faith often fail, and instead we need to build bridges of belief.
Yes.
Can you talk about this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, see, all of these intertwine. And I've built a number of them. I would go so far as to say that if not the average case that a nonprofit develops is at its heart, when you boil all the stuff down to it, is essentially asking for a leap of faith. Meaning, we're going to do a good job with your money, trust us. We are going to work to solve this problem, trust us. And you may push back on that and say, but we've got all this evidence. And I'm like, okay, fine. And I'm going to get real wonky on you here for a moment, but evidence is a deductive argument, right? So we are basically saying we're going to give you all of the specific information about us, and we're going to hope you map that to something that might be true, right? That all of these testimonials, all these case studies, all of these other things are going to translate into our ability to do this again in the future. And what we miss in many of our cases is getting people to understand it from and I'm probably flipping the kind of argument that I'm trying to talk about. Flip it from the other side, which I believe is inductive, where we're trying to basically take, and again, I should stay away from the title, don't know what they are, where we're actually trying to take broad principles that people already agree with that know are true, and then show how they apply in the work that we do. And then support that with the evidence that we have that in fact, that approach works here. So by doing that, and this comes back to how do you say something they can't unhear? Let's go back to that Boston Conservatory case. Instead of saying, trust us, we're a good investment.
Trust us.
Right? Or look at all our, look at our successful alumni, which don't mean that your child is going to be successful. It just means that one was. And we're hoping that you go, well, if they could be successful, my kid too, right? But again, if they sit back and rationalize on that, they're like, well, maybe Alex, they love it. I'm not sure the world's going to love them, right? Like, I don't know. I mean, I think, maybe they're completely convinced. But if we start and we lay out those things, okay, do you want to know the answer to this question? Yes, I do. Are we going to be worth it? How are you going to make sure that my child is employed afterwards? And then we articulate our core principle of saying, that employability, right, is as important as talent ability, right, when it comes to being employed. And you're like, yeah, I agree. And not only that, right, in order to be employable, this person has to be ready for as many different scenarios as possible. They have to be flexible, adaptable. They have to know what it's like to play in a pit and play in an orchestra and play in a trio and play in a whatever. And they go, yeah, okay, that makes sense. And then you say, that's what we do here. Now let's show you how.
Yeah.
Now let's show you the case studies. Now let's show you the testimonials. Now we can show you what the thing is. Because what we've started is saying we've based a bridge of belief, which is, okay, I agree that an approach based on that would do this. Then we have to make that rest of the case true. And that's what we're doing. Instead of just saying, we're a good investment, trust us. We're saying, you're giving the people enough agreement all the way along to go, yes, I agree that that is my primary concern. That is what I want to have happen after my child graduates. And I agree with these 2 core principles behind your approach. And so I agree in principle that this will work. And then, yes, your job is, and I agree that how you're doing what you're doing shows that it's actually also possible in practice. And therefore, I will pay to send my child there. So that's what we're trying to do.
People like us do things like this.
Yeah, it's very much a Seth Godin thing. Yeah. And the thing is that a lot of times we are not explicit about what we actually mean by that. It's so much a part of how we see the world that it doesn't occur to us to make it explicit. And yet it is those implicit things that really determine the alignment with the approach that any nonprofit is taking. Because I may believe in why you do what you do. I may believe that climate change is important. But if I don't agree with how you do what you do or why you do it that way, then does it matter? Because again, I may be like, oh, that's great. And then if I don't like how you talk to me, if I don't like how frequently you're asking me for money, if I don't like the fact that you're constantly batting me over the head with like, it's awful, that's going eventually, that's the reason why I'm going to stop giving. That's the reason why I'm going to stop supporting. That's the reason why I'm going to stop working with you, or working for you. Not because I don't believe in the mission. It's because I don't believe necessarily in on the principles that are driving how you're carrying it out.
Absolutely. Oh, wow. So powerful. I completely agree with that. And I look at it as almost this like map. It's sort of like a choose your own adventure. Like first you have to agree with the question.
Yeah.
Or be asking the question. It has to be a question that you're interested in that you're asking. And then the next level is, the how and the premise and what the organization is doing that sets them apart. Yeah, I think we just don't get into the nuance of it. And that's what holds us up.
That's exactly right. And that's really, the third proverb in the book is that principles set patterns. And what I mean by that is that it is those implicit principles, those underlying principles, communications theorists, Argyris and Schoen call them, our theories in use, not the ones that we say are our values, the ones that are actually guiding us day in, day out. And those you have to sometimes reverse engineer to find. Because that's what I had to do at the conservatory was to say, reverse engineer. Well, why are we multiply disciplinary? Why do we actually think that that's going to work? Why do we think our graduates are successful, right? When obviously this other approach works too, but why do we think ours are, right? And it was like, well, because they know they're actually really flexible. Okay, what does that do for them? That makes them more, makes them more employable. Okay, so it's not the talent's not important, but we have to get that. So being able to really get those things out, because it's those things that set the patterns of our programming. It's what sets why, it's our principles that determine what we pursue. It's our principles that determine what we think are problems. The principles that we are aligned with, that we hold dear, whether we realize it or not, are the ones that set the patterns of our decisions and our behavior. And so if
in our personal life too, I can see a lot of applications for that.
Absolutely. So if we're not aligned at the principle level, and these are core principles to how you and your organization does your work, it's not going to work long term. It's just not going to work long term. And this is what I saw over and over and over and over again. And I was like, either you are saying your principles are one thing and then you're actually doing something else. So just as an example of that, back to the conservatory, not all about the conservatory, I promise. But when I first got there, from a marketing perspective, they were calling it interdisciplinary work, which meant that there was an actual integration of the curriculum. And that actually wasn't true. And so I was like, that's your, Argyris and Schoen would call it your espoused theory. That's what you say your principle is. But the reality is they just kind of coexist with each other. But there's still value there. So how do we articulate the value that exists because We're not just doing it because we don't see a better option. We are continuing with that because it is delivering something for us. What and why do we think that's important? So it's really, this is obviously, I can get on a soapbox about this all day long, but that I think is some of the deepest work that an organization can do, is really have sometimes a hard conversation with itself about, is there a gap between what we, or even do we know what the principles that are actually guiding our day-to-day work actually are? And I would suggest, though, that some of that conflict that has arisen in the last 10 years around donor-centered fundraising has actually come because we start to realize there actually is a gap in those principles, because we are asking money from people who may, in fact, be contributing to the systemic issues that are creating the problem that we are asking them money to solve. And so all of a sudden you're like, whoa, 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 whoa. And so that's why I think, like, by putting that question at the center, by putting the narrative of the organization at the center, which is we are trying to answer this question and we are bringing these principles to bear in our approach to it. We don't know how it's going to answer it yet, but if you agree with these principles, then what it starts to do is it starts to put all of that at the center. So the donors that align with those principles, they're the donors that are going to be the ones that are going to work for us. It will help us align with the community because it will tell us how are we trying to engage with them and what role and how we actually think about the community that we serve. And fundamentally, it helps us understand how do we make sure that the mission is viable, going forward.
I love that. I was waiting for you to just keep going. I just want to listen. I love narrative, the thought of narrative-centered fundraising. And what you said is so important, because I do feel like fundraisers kind of get whiplash where it's, we're supposed to be asking for money, like nonprofit-centered, and then we were donor-centered, and then we're community-centered. But I think if you're narrative-centered, it covers all your bases, and it's almost generous. And, I always believe in having empathy for your donors. They're busy. They want to solve a problem. They're looking to you to be the go-to resource. They're looking for messages that they can't unhear. All of us are looking for these messages. And I think it's an act of generosity to be intentional and create these messages for the right group of people that want to hear them. So I love this. So we have to wrap up. But do you have one last thought to share? And then I would love, tell everybody where they can find you and find the book.
Yes. So they can find me and my work at messagedesigninstitute.com. So that is launching. That will have been launched, actually.
Yes, by the time this comes out.
So they can find that, and I'm at tamsenwebster.com. I'm literally the only Tamsen Webster spelled that way in the universe, so I'm easy to find.
I'm the only Julia Campbell. No, I'm just kidding. I'm obviously just kidding.
I love that. And the book, you can find the book in all of those places, but the quick way to get there is littlechangebook.com. And that will think of it as the 9 principles that any nonprofit leader, fundraiser, et cetera, needs to know about people to get that long-term behavior shift and change that they want.
Littlechangebook.com. I know everyone is going to be going there and grabbing a copy. Sign up for Tamsen's newsletter. It's fantastic. Find your red thread completely. And also, I will post the link to our previous episode when Find Your Red Thread came out, because that also builds on these principles, or this book builds on those principles. And it's just another fantastic resource, I think, for anyone trying to communicate an idea and trying to get people to, create change. So thank you so much, Tamsen, for
pleasure.
Being here. Okay.
I always love talking to people about nonprofits. So this is always a joy. So thank you so much.
Well, hey there. I wanted to say thank you for tuning into my show and for listening all the way to the end. If you really enjoyed today's conversation, make sure to subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast app, and you'll get new episodes downloaded as soon as they come out. I would love if you left me a rating or a review, because this tells other people that my podcast is worth listening to. And then me and my guests can reach even more earbuds and create even more impact. So that's pretty much it. I'll be back soon with a brand new episode. But until then, you can find me on Instagram at JuliaCampbell77. Keep changing the world, you nonprofit unicorn.